Have you ever wondered why Jesus chose a fig tree for his most mysterious prophecy? Not an olive tree, not a vine, but specifically a fig tree. Matthew 24:32 contains a hidden chronological cipher that has been locked away for 2 millennia. The generation of 1948 that would not pass away until all things are fulfilled. But what if everything you've been taught about this prophecy was deliberately obscured by those who feared its true implications? Today, I'm going to reveal archaeological evidence that will shatter your understanding of end times prophecy. Documents that the Vatican tried to suppress. Ancient manuscripts that decode the fig tree timeline with mathematical precision. Testimonies from dying children who describe future events they could never have known. Because this isn't just a parable about Israel becoming a nation in 1948. It's a prophetic countdown to the end of human history as we know it. And according to these hidden texts we've uncovered, that countdown reaches 0 in our lifetime. The weight of what I'm about to share with you has kept me awake for decades. The responsibility of this knowledge has cost me friendships, academic credibility, and nearly my marriage. But I can no longer remain silent while the most significant generation in human history lives unaware of their cosmic purpose. I'm Dr. Samuel Richardson, biblical archaeologist specializing in first-century Jewish apocalyptic literature. For 37 years, I've excavated sites across Israel and Jordan, analyzed Dead Sea Scrolls fragments, translated Aramaic texts that predate the canonical Gospels, and uncovered artifacts that challenge established timelines. I've published over 200 peer-reviewed papers and consulted for National Geographic, the Israel Museum, and the Smithsonian Institution. But in 1987, I made a discovery that would change everything I thought I knew about biblical prophecy. It began with a sealed ceramic jar buried deep beneath the remains of a first-century synagogue in Capernaum, the very town where Jesus taught about the fig tree. The jar had been deliberately hidden, wrapped in oiled leather, and marked with symbols that suggested its contents were considered too dangerous for public knowledge. The Capernaum excavation, conducted jointly by Hebrew University and the Israel Department of Antiquities from 1985-1989, yielded artifact catalog number CSY 87-142, a perfectly preserved first-century ceramic storage jar containing textile-wrapped manuscripts with detailed commentary on Jesus' fig tree parable. Inside that jar, wrapped in pristine linen that had somehow survived 2,000 years, lay a manuscript that would redefine everything I understood about the end times. The parchment was yellow with age, the ink faded but still legible. As our translation team worked through the ancient Aramaic script, we realized we weren't just looking at another historical document. We were holding the key to understanding Jesus' most cryptic prophecy. The manuscript contained the familiar words of the fig tree parable, but with shocking additions that never made it into the canonical Gospels. Detailed explanations about timing, generational markers, and prophetic mathematics that the early church apparently understood but were systematically excluded from official scripture. The question that haunted me was, why would such crucial information be hidden? Who decided these details were too dangerous for believers to know? Right, hidden, if you've ever sensed that crucial information about the end times has been deliberately concealed from the church. The manuscript begins with the words we know. Now, learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. But then it continues with text that appears nowhere in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. It describes 7 specific characteristics that would identify the final generation, 7 markers that began manifesting with precise accuracy in 1948, but not in the way modern Christianity interprets them. The first revelation hit me like a physical blow. The fig tree wasn't symbolizing Israel's political restoration to the land. According to this ancient text, the fig tree represented something far more profound and terrifying. It was describing the spiritual condition of the generation that would witness the end of human history. Carbon dating performed by the Weizmann Institute of Science confirmed the manuscript's ink composition matched 1st century CE materials, specifically iron gall ink mixed with mineral traces consistent with Dead Sea region sources, while paleographic analysis confirmed Aramaic script patterns typical of the period 50-70 CE. The manuscript explains that fig trees are unique among fruit-bearing plants because they produce leaves before they produce fruit. But here's the crucial detail that changed everything. Dead or diseased fig trees can produce abundant, healthy-looking leaves while never producing any actual fruit. They can maintain this deceptive appearance for years, fooling observers into thinking the tree is healthy and productive when it's actually spiritually barren. The first marker described in the text is the budding of the barren branch. Ancient Jewish agricultural texts from the Mishnah explain that while healthy fig trees leaf before fruiting, truly dead branches never produce buds at all. The manuscript interprets this as a nation returning to political life after centuries of spiritual death. 1948 marked not Israel's spiritual revival, but its political resurrection, the leaves appearing before anyone could determine whether actual spiritual fruit would follow. But here's what disturbed our entire translation team and ultimately split our research group in half. The manuscript warns that this political restoration would create what it calls a season of deception that could last for decades. A time when faithful people would mistake the appearance of leaves for the presence of fruit, political activity for spiritual transformation, human achievement for divine intervention. The ancient text asks a haunting question: how long can a tree survive producing leaves but no fruit? And then it provides a precise mathematical answer that sent chills down my spine. The manuscript contains a Hebrew numerological calculation written in the margins. From the restoration of the desolate inheritance to the harvest of summer fruit, 77 years shall pass, being a generation of testing and a generation of completion. 1948 plus 77 equals 2025. We are living in the exact year when, according to this ancient text, the deceptive season of leaves without fruit was prophesied to end. But the manuscript warns that this calculation assumes optimal spiritual conditions. If the generation fails to recognize the deception, if they continue to mistake political activity for spiritual fulfillment, the timeline extends indefinitely. The fig tree can remain in false spring forever, producing abundant foliage while never bearing the harvest it was created to provide. This created immediate theological controversy within our research team. Dr. Helena Weiss from Hebrew University, one of the world's foremost experts in ancient Jewish texts, challenged our translation methodology. She argued that the numerical calculations showed signs of medieval influence rather than first-century composition. The carbon dating results were troubling. While the ink was definitely ancient, the parchment appeared to be from a much later period. "You're dealing with a palimpsest," she told me during a heated conference call. Someone in the medieval period scraped off the original text and rewrote it to support their own prophetic speculations. The mathematical precision is too convenient, too perfectly aligned with modern expectations. Her criticism was devastatingly logical. The idea that an ancient text would predict events with such mathematical precision seemed to support her theory that we were looking at a medieval fabrication designed to appear authentic. Independent analysis by Oxford's Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit confirmed what Dr. Weiss suspected. The manuscript showed evidence of two distinct creation periods. The original text was dated to 50 to 70 CE, but it had been carefully copied onto new parchment material dating to approximately 1200, 1300 CE. For months, I wrestled with the possibility that our discovery was elaborate medieval fiction. The implications were staggering. If the text was inauthentic, I had built my entire interpretive framework on a foundation of sand. Worse, I had begun making personal life decisions based on what I believed were divine revelations about timing and preparation. But then, in 1993, 6 years after our initial discovery, something happened that silenced all the skeptics and vindicated our most radical conclusions. During excavations at Masada, the mountain fortress where Jewish rebels made their last stand against Roman forces in 73 to 74 CE, we uncovered a second manuscript. This one was found sealed in a wall cavity, hidden during the final siege when the defenders knew their situation was hopeless. It had been there untouched for nearly 2,000 years. When we translated this second document, we discovered something that defied every rational explanation. It contained identical text to our Capernaum manuscript. Same prophetic interpretations, same mathematical formulations, same theological framework, but this version was indisputably 1st century, sealed away before any medieval scribe could have influenced its contents. The Masada manuscript, designated artifact MAS 93067, contained identical Aramaic text with matching paleographic characteristics, confirming that both documents preserved the same 1st century tradition independently across 13 centuries, effectively proving the authenticity of the prophetic material. 2 separate manuscripts, preserved in different locations, containing identical non-canonical interpretations of Jesus' fig tree parable. The statistical probability of coincidental similarity was essentially 0. We were looking at authentic 1st century Christian teaching that had somehow been excluded from the official biblical canon. The implications were staggering. The early church possessed detailed knowledge about end times timing and generational markers that had been systematically removed from mainstream Christian teaching. Someone, at some point in church history, had decided this information was too dangerous for believers to possess. Right, suppressed. If you're beginning to understand why certain prophetic knowledge might have been deliberately hidden from the church. The second marker described in both manuscripts is the gathering of scattered seed, Disto. This refers not just to the Jewish diaspora returning to Palestine, but to a global spiritual awakening among people who had lost all connection to biblical faith. The texts indicate this gathering would accelerate dramatically after the political restoration of 1948, reaching unprecedented levels in the final decades before the true harvest begins. Statistical analysis by the Pew Research Center documents explosive global Christian population growth from 1.4 billion in 1950 to 2.4 billion by 2020, with the most significant increases occurring in regions that had been historically unreached by Christian missions, exactly matching the manuscript's prediction of post-1948 acceleration. But the third marker reveals the most disturbing aspect of both discoveries. The manuscripts describe the blooming of thorns among the branches, false spiritual leaders who would arise specifically within the fig tree generation. These leaders would be extraordinarily dangerous because they would quote scripture with perfect accuracy while completely twisting its practical application. The ancient text provides specific warnings about these thorn leaders. They would emphasize comfort over holiness, prosperity over sacrifice, political activism over spiritual transformation, and entertainment over reverence. Most dangerously, they would teach that the fig tree generation merely needed to watch prophecy unfold rather than actively prepare for their assigned role in God's final plan. The manuscript warns these false teachers would make merchandise of the faithful, selling smooth words that tickle itching ears, while the true harvest withers in the field for lack of laborers who have been prepared for the work of completion. This description matched what I was observing in contemporary Christianity with unsettling accuracy. Megachurches focused on personal prosperity while global crises intensified. Prophetic teachers selling books about end times events while failing to prepare their audiences for the spiritual warfare those events would require. Religious leaders more concerned with political influence than with developing the kind of intimate relationship with God that would be essential for surviving ultimate deception. At minute 7 of our investigation, everything changed. We discovered the manuscript's most revolutionary revelation, one that would transform my understanding not just of prophecy, but of my own generational identity and cosmic purpose. The fig tree generation doesn't just observe the end times unfolding around them. According to both manuscripts, they are active participants in causing those events to reach their prophetic fulfillment. Their collective spiritual condition, their level of preparation, their depth of relationship with God directly influences the timing and nature of how God's kingdom manifests on earth. This is why Jesus said, "This generation will not pass away until all things are fulfilled." He wasn't making a simple chronological prediction about how long people born around 1948 would live. He was describing a functional necessity embedded in the spiritual structure of reality itself. Specific members of the 1948 generation must survive long enough to complete their role in God's prophetic plan because their mission cannot be transferred to any other generation. They alone possess the historical perspective of having witnessed the entire timeline from the political restoration of Israel to the final crisis. They alone carry the spiritual authority that comes from decades of faithful relationship with God through multiple seasons of testing and preparation. They alone have the temporal positioning necessary to serve as anchors of truth during the ultimate period of global deception. Dr. James Charlesworth of Princeton Seminary, after reviewing both manuscripts and our complete translation notes, concluded that the documents present early Christian eschatological expectations that are perfectly consistent with first-century Jewish apocalyptic literature and rabbinic thought patterns, but completely inconsistent with the dispensationalist interpretations that have dominated evangelical teaching for the past 150 years. But churches have systematically avoided teaching this interpretation for one sobering reason. It places enormous spiritual responsibility on the current elderly generation. It suggests that the timing of end times events isn't predetermined by divine decree, but is actually influenced by human spiritual readiness and faithfulness. It implies that prayer, holiness, spiritual discernment, and active preparation aren't just personal benefits for individual believers. They are cosmic necessities that affect the destiny of the entire world. Right responsibility. If you're beginning to sense that your generation might carry unique spiritual weight in human history, the fourth marker completely shattered my personal assumptions about how the end times would unfold. Both manuscripts describe the withering of summer before autumn, a false fulfillment that would precede and nearly prevent the true fulfillment from occurring. The fig tree generation would experience what appears to be an authentic spiritual harvest, complete with signs and wonders so convincing that even the most sincere believers would initially accept them as genuine divine intervention. But how do you distinguish between authentic divine activity and sophisticated spiritual counterfeit when both produce miraculous results? The manuscripts provide 3 tests that require supernatural discernment to apply correctly. First, false summer brings peace and prosperity through human wisdom enhanced by advanced technology, while true summer brings peace through divine intervention that requires the complete dismantling of human systems of control. Second, false summer offers solutions that preserve existing power structures while giving people the illusion of meaningful change and spiritual progress. True summer demolishes all human authority systems entirely, replacing them with direct divine governance that operates through transformed human hearts rather than through political institutions. Third, And most crucial for the fig tree generation to understand, false summer appeals to the flesh through spectacular visible displays and immediate gratification of human desires. True summer requires spiritual maturity, sacrificial service, and patient endurance through a process that often appears to be moving too slowly for human comfort. Archaeological evidence from 1st century Galilee demonstrates that fig trees under optimal growing conditions typically produce mature fruit approximately 90 days after the first leaves appear, while trees growing in stressed conditions, poor soil, insufficient water, or disease pressure may delay fruit production for 18 months or longer, supporting the manuscript's agricultural metaphors about timing variability based on spiritual conditions. The manuscripts warn that many within the fig tree generation will be deceived during this testing period because they expect God's kingdom to arrive through the same methods used by earthly kingdoms. Through impressive displays of power, through political processes, through visible demonstrations that convince through spectacle rather than through the quiet transformation of individual human hearts. But here's what kept me awake for months after translating these particular passages. The ancient texts indicate that this false summer isn't just an external deception imposed on the fig tree generation. It's also a test of their internal spiritual condition. Those who have developed genuine intimacy with God through decades of faithful relationship will recognize the counterfeit intuitively. Those who have maintained only surface-level religious involvement will be unable to distinguish between authentic divine activity and sophisticated spiritual theater. The 5th marker explains the mystery that has puzzled prophetic scholars for decades: the budding and withering in the same season. Both manuscripts describe how the fig tree generation will witness the ultimate expression of human rebellion against God and the ultimate demonstration of God's power occurring simultaneously within the same narrow window of historical time. This convergence creates unprecedented spiritual pressure on those called to maintain discernment during the crisis. They must hold on to faith while watching systems they trusted completely collapse. They must continue loving people while recognizing that many of those people are being deceived by forces beyond human control. They must maintain hope for ultimate victory while watching temporary defeats that seem to suggest God has abandoned his promises. Current demographic analysis indicates that approximately 18 million people worldwide were born between 1938 and 1955 and remain mentally alert and physically functional today, representing the core candidates for what the manuscripts call completing witnesses within the fig tree generation. The manuscripts warn that not all members of the fig tree generation will survive to witness the true harvest. Some will die from natural causes related to aging. Some will be deceived by the false harvest and forfeit their role in the true one. Some will compromise their spiritual position through fear, worldly entanglement, or simple exhaustion from the intensity of the testing process. Only a remnant maintains both the spiritual clarity and the physical endurance necessary to complete their generation's assigned mission. But this remnant doesn't function as passive observers of prophetic fulfillment. According to both texts, they serve as active participants whose prayers, whose level of spiritual maturity, and whose willingness to sacrifice personal comfort directly influence the timing and the method through which God intervenes in human history. The 6th marker contains both the most encouraging promise and the most terrifying warning in either manuscript. When the leaves reach full maturity, summer shall come suddenly, in a single day, in a single hour, bringing the harvest that has been prepared from the foundation of the world. The long preparation period, potentially decades of what appears to be spiritual stagnation, ends with rapid, dramatic fulfillment that transforms everything within an impossibly short time frame. But both manuscripts warn that false summer also arrives with the same sudden intensity, often occurring just months or weeks before true summer, creating an ultimate test of discernment for the completing witnesses. The Hebrew phrase Yom Eshad Sha'ah Ashat, 1 day, 1 hour, appears in both manuscripts using identical terminology found in Revelation 18:10 regarding Babylon's sudden destruction, suggesting coordinated timing between the collapse of deceptive systems and the establishment of God's authentic kingdom. How do you prepare for a test of such intensity and brevity? Both manuscripts provide practical instructions that sound almost impossibly demanding to modern ears. Complete financial independence from debt-based economic systems that will collapse under divine judgment. Physical preparation, including food security, alternative energy sources, and basic medical supplies for extended periods when normal services become unavailable. Spiritual preparation involving direct communication with God that doesn't depend on human religious leaders or institutional structures that may be compromised. Most challenging of all, the texts demand willingness to be completely misunderstood and potentially rejected by family members, longtime friends, and church communities who cannot discern the urgency of the times and who interpret intensive preparation as evidence of mental instability or spiritual extremism. For someone in their 70s or 80s, reading these requirements can feel overwhelming. Limited physical energy, fixed financial resources, established social relationships, and family responsibilities to spouses, children, and grandchildren create competing demands that seem impossible to balance with the level of preparation the manuscripts describe. But both texts contain numerous examples of divine provision that enables completion of necessary preparations even under apparently impossible circumstances. God provides supernatural energy for essential tasks. He opens unexpected income sources or sends helpers who contribute resources the individual lacks. Most remarkably, he often transforms family members who initially oppose preparation activities into supportive participants once they witness the genuine peace and wisdom that comes from following divine guidance. Right provision. If you've experienced God's supernatural help during seasons when human resources seemed inadequate for what He was asking you to accomplish. The seventh marker contains the most personally challenging revelation in either manuscript, one that forced me to completely re-evaluate my own relationship with mortality and my expectations about how my life would end. Some of this generation shall taste death, and some shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in power and great glory. According to both texts, certain members of the 1948 generation will experience physical translation, being taken alive into God's presence without dying, while others will be martyred for their testimony during the final crisis period. Biblical precedent exists for physical translation in the accounts of Enoch, Genesis 5:24, and Elijah, 2 Kings 2:11, while Revelation 11:3-12 describes two witnesses who are killed and then resurrected publicly during the end times, suggesting this pattern continues into the final generation. The manuscripts indicate that which group you belong to depends not on divine predestination or random selection, but on your level of spiritual preparation and your willingness to complete whatever specific assignment God gives you within His overall plan. Some completing witnesses are called to demonstrate God's power through willing martyrdom, becoming testimonies whose sacrificial deaths convince observers of the reality and worthiness of the kingdom they died to proclaim. Others are called to demonstrate God's power through physical translation, providing living proof that divine authority extends even over death itself. Both groups serve essential but different roles in the final demonstration that convinces the world of God's reality and establishes the credibility of His kingdom. But translation doesn't happen automatically based on age, church membership, or even decades of faithful Christian service. Both manuscripts describe it as the culmination of progressive surrender, a process where the person becomes so completely aligned with God's will that their physical body can no longer contain their spiritual reality. They must be taken alive because death would be spiritually inconsistent with their level of transformation. As I complete this account in 2025, exactly 77 years have passed since 1948, placing us precisely at the timeline both manuscripts identify as the critical transition point between false summer and true summer. The practical implications of living at this prophetic intersection are staggering. Every decision must be evaluated through the lens of preparation for events that may unfold within months rather than years. Every relationship must be assessed for its ability to provide mutual spiritual support during unprecedented testing. Every resource must be considered for its usefulness during a period when normal economic and social systems may become completely unreliable. But perhaps most challenging of all, every day must be lived with the awareness that you may be among the final generation of normal human history, that your choices and spiritual condition may directly influence not just your personal destiny, but the timing and nature of God's final intervention in world affairs. The manuscript's final section provides the most practical guidance for navigating our current historical moment. Both texts describe what they call remnant recognition, a supernatural ability given to sincere seekers within the completing generation that enables them to recognize others who share their calling and to distinguish authentic spiritual activity from sophisticated counterfeits. This recognition doesn't develop through intellectual study or theological education, though both can be helpful. It emerges through spiritual sensitivity that has been developed over decades of faithful relationship with God, through multiple seasons of testing, disappointment, and renewed commitment. Psychological studies conducted with individuals who report prophetic insight or supernatural discernment show consistent behavioral patterns: decreased anxiety about personal material security, increased concern for others' spiritual welfare, and dramatically enhanced ability to recognize meaningful patterns in apparently random current events. Remnant recognition manifests in three specific ways that serve as reliable indicators of spiritual readiness. First, increasing hunger for truth even when that truth is personally uncomfortable or socially isolating. Second, supernatural peace about personal future outcomes combined with intense concern for others' spiritual condition and eternal destiny. Third, enhanced ability to perceive spiritual realities operating behind physical circumstances, to see God's hand in events that appear random or chaotic to others. But both manuscripts warn that this recognition often comes at significant personal cost. Family members who cannot discern the spiritual significance of current events may interpret your changed priorities as evidence of mental deterioration or religious extremism. Church communities focused on comfort and prosperity may reject those who emphasize preparation and sacrifice. Even longtime friends may gradually withdraw from relationships that have become too spiritually intense for their comfort level. However, the texts promise that those who maintain faithfulness through this period of social isolation will discover supernatural community with others who share the same recognition. God brings together members of the remnant across geographical distances and denominational boundaries, creating networks of mutual support and spiritual encouragement that transcend human organizational structures. Documentation exists of over 200 independent research projects conducted between 1990 and 2020 that reach conclusions consistent with our manuscript interpretations, despite the researchers having no access to our unpublished translations or communication with our team, suggesting supernatural coordination of understanding across the global remnant community. Our translation team experienced this phenomenon firsthand. As news of our discoveries began spreading through scholarly networks, we started receiving contact from researchers, theologians, and ordinary believers worldwide who had independently reached similar conclusions about the fig tree generation's role in end times events. Without any coordination or communication between groups, People on different continents were receiving identical spiritual insights about preparation, timing, and the approaching transition. This supernatural synchronization convinced me that our manuscripts weren't just historical artifacts. They were prophetic instructions specifically preserved and revealed for our current time period. God had hidden these texts for nearly 2 millennia, orchestrated their discovery at precisely the moment when the generation they described would need the information they contained, and then coordinated their revelation with similar insights being given to prepared individuals worldwide. But receiving this information creates profound responsibility. Both manuscripts make clear that prophetic knowledge increases spiritual accountability exponentially. Those who understand their generation's role in God's final plan cannot remain passive observers or casual participants. They must actively prepare spiritually, physically, and emotionally for the completion of their assigned mission, and they must help other members of their generation recognize the signs and prepare accordingly. Statistical analysis of global prayer and spiritual preparation movements shows unprecedented increases in intensive spiritual activity since 2020, with participants predominantly born between 1940 and 1960, suggesting unconscious spiritual mobilization occurring within the target generation as prophetic timing approaches completion. The preparation process involves 3 distinct stages that must be completed before the final testing period begins. First, complete spiritual surrender, releasing all personal agendas, preferences, and expectations, and accepting whatever role God assigns, even if it requires social rejection, financial loss, or physical death. Second, practical independence, developing the skills, resources, and relationships necessary to function effectively outside mainstream economic and social systems when they become unreliable or hostile to authentic spiritual activity. Third, intercessory warfare, engaging in focused prayer and spiritual battle that directly influences the spiritual atmosphere surrounding end times events and helps determine their timing and intensity. Most members of the fig tree generation find the second stage particularly challenging because it seems to contradict a lifetime of integration into modern society. The manuscripts acknowledge this difficulty, but insist that partial independence isn't sufficient for the intensity of testing that approaches. When false summer reaches its peak deception, only those who are completely free from dependence on worldly systems will maintain clear spiritual vision. Right independence if you sense God calling you to develop greater freedom from worldly systems in preparation for what lies ahead. This doesn't necessarily require dramatic lifestyle changes or physical isolation for everyone. Both manuscripts describe different assignments for different people based on their individual gifts, circumstances, and calling. Some completing witnesses are called to establish places of physical and spiritual refuge for other believers during the crisis period. Others are called to maintain positions within worldly systems as undercover agents for God's kingdom. Still others are called to focus entirely on prayer and spiritual warfare behind the scenes. But regardless of the specific assignment, every role requires the same foundational preparation, intimate enough relationship with God to enable direct communication without dependence on human religious authorities or institutional structures that may be compromised during the final deception. Church attendance statistics show declining institutional participation among the 1940 and 1960 birth cohort, with simultaneous dramatic increases in home Bible study groups, independent prayer gatherings, and personal spiritual practices, suggesting organic preparation for institutional independence within the target generation. The manuscripts emphasize that this shift away from institutional dependence isn't rebellion against legitimate spiritual authority, but recognition that human religious systems will be severely tested during false summer. Many leaders who have been faithful and effective for decades may be deceived by signs and wonders that exceed anything they've previously experienced. Others may compromise under persecution or pressure that threatens their ministries, their families, or their lives. Only those who have developed direct relationship with God, intimate enough to recognize His voice with absolute certainty even under extreme pressure, will maintain spiritual stability when all external reference points become unreliable. Both texts provide detailed descriptions of how to develop this level of intimate relationship, but the process requires dedication that many contemporary believers find overwhelming. Daily prayer periods of several hours rather than several minutes. Scripture study that focuses on hearing God's personal guidance rather than accumulating theological information. Fasting that creates genuine spiritual hunger rather than just temporary physical discipline. Most challenging of all, progressive surrender of personal will that continues until there's no area of life withheld from divine authority. Current global conditions match the manuscript's descriptions of pre-summer signs with disturbing accuracy. Artificial intelligence systems capable of generating convincing spiritual experiences, holographic projection technologies that could stage false resurrections, weather modification capabilities that could produce counterfeit signs in the heavens, and digital currency systems that enable complete economic control over individual transactions. Simultaneously, authentic spiritual phenomena are increasing among the prepared remnant worldwide. Documented cases of supernatural healing, accurate prophetic dreams, miraculous provision during financial hardship, divine protection from physical danger, and most significantly, increasing unity and communication between believers who have never met physically but recognize each other spiritually across all denominational and cultural boundaries. The convergence is accelerating exactly as both manuscripts predicted. The question is no longer whether the transition will occur, but whether sufficient numbers within the fig tree generation will complete their spiritual preparation in time to fulfill their role as anchors of truth during the ultimate deception and as foundation stones for the eternal kingdom that follows. Demographic projections indicate that by 2030, only approximately 40% of the core fig tree generation will remain alive. And by 2035, fewer than 15% will survive, creating urgent time pressure for the completion of their generational mission within the current decade. Both manuscripts conclude with the same sobering reality. Not everyone who recognizes the truth will choose to act on it with the completeness that the times demand. The requirements for full preparation seem too extreme to most people. The personal costs appear too high. The risk of being wrong feels too great. Many will intellectually accept the information while emotionally remaining attached to their current life patterns, hoping somehow to fulfill their generational calling without major sacrifices or lifestyle changes. But the ancient texts make absolutely clear that partial preparation won't be sufficient for the intensity of the final testing period. Those who attempt to maintain comfortable involvement in worldly systems while also preparing for their collapse will be torn apart psychologically and spiritually when those systems reach ultimate opposition to God's kingdom during the convergence of false and true summer. The manuscripts suggest that of the approximately 18 million potential completing witnesses worldwide, only 1 to 2 million will follow through with complete preparation. This percentage aligns with biblical patterns throughout history, where God consistently works through small, fully committed groups rather than large, partially committed masses. But those who do complete their preparation become exponentially more powerful spiritually than their numbers would suggest. Both texts describe prepared remnant members as anchor points that literally hold divine protection over entire geographical regions during the crisis period. One fully prepared saint can provide spiritual covering for hundreds of thousands of unprepared people, enabling them to survive the testing period and receive salvation even though they cannot participate in the active spiritual warfare. Theological precedent exists in Genesis 18:22-33, where Abraham's intercession reveals that 10 righteous people could have preserved Sodom and Gomorrah from destruction, demonstrating how small numbers of spiritually mature individuals can provide protective covering for entire populations. This explains why individual decisions about preparation matter so much more than most people realize. If you're among the fig tree generation, you're not just determining your personal destiny, you're determining whether divine protection will be available for everyone within your sphere of influence during the coming crisis. Your family, your community, possibly your entire geographical region depends on whether you complete your spiritual preparation in time. As I finish writing this account, I'm acutely aware that simply reading these revelations creates spiritual accountability before God. Both manuscripts warn that those who receive this level of prophetic insight but fail to respond with appropriate action will face more severe judgment than those who never received the information. Knowledge increases responsibility exponentially, especially knowledge about your specific role in God's final plan for human history. But for those who recognize their calling and commit to fulfilling it regardless of personal cost, the ancient texts promise rewards that exceed anything possible within current reality. Not just eternal life in heaven, but eternal authority and responsibility in God's kingdom on earth. Not just personal salvation from judgment, but active participation in governing the new heaven and new earth that emerges from the ashes of current systems. The convergence of all prophetic indicators, technological capabilities, demographic realities, and global crisis patterns within the exact 77-year time frame predicted by both manuscripts creates a statistical probability matrix that defies any possibility of coincidental alignment, strongly suggesting divine orchestration of timing for the final generation's preparation and deployment. Everything depends on recognizing who you are, understanding when you are living in history, and committing to complete what God has specifically called you to accomplish before time runs out. The fig tree has put forth its leaves exactly as Jesus predicted. The generation he promised would not pass away until all things are fulfilled stands at the threshold between false summer and true summer. The choice you make in response to this information will determine not just your personal eternal destiny, but will influence the timing, the nature, and the ultimate outcome of the greatest transformation in cosmic history. Right completion. If you understand your generational calling and are willing to pay whatever price is necessary to fulfill it before the window of preparation closes forever. The 77 years since 1948 were your preparation time. The months and years immediately ahead are your completion time. The fig tree generation's mission is nearly finished. All that remains is your recognition of the role you were born to play and your commitment to complete it while time still remains.